Good morning and welcome to the viewing and listening audience to this, the fourth virtual hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration. This is the committee's fourth hearing with stakeholders pursuant to its inquiry into the effects of the hybrid and blended learning system on student performance in government and government-assisted schools during the COVID-19 restrictions. Members of the public are invited to submit your comments or questions on the Parliament's social media platforms, YouTube channel, ParlView, or via Facebook and Twitter. We'd like to thank you all for being with us this morning. At this time, I'd like to take time before we head into today's substantive business to acknowledge, as we have done yesterday in the Senate, the passing of former Minister of Energy and Energy Industries, Franklin Kahn, and send condolences and some sympathy and support and prayers to his family at this time. He certainly was one of the significant contributors to the development of Trinidad and Tobago, and we will certainly miss him. At this time, I'd like to introduce the representatives who are with us today, who include the following: the Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, TATT, the Telecommunications Services of Trinidad and Tobago, TSTT, Digicel Trinidad and Tobago, and the Columbus Communication Trinidad Limited, FLO. This inquiry's objectives include four main objectives. One, to assess the effectiveness of the hybrid blended learning system used by government and government-assisted schools in curriculum delivery, to compare and contrast student performance using traditional versus hybrid blended learning systems for similar time periods, to examine the systems and methods used to monitor and evaluate student performance in the hybrid blended learning system, and four, to assess the readiness of the hybrid blended learning system to adequately prepare students for external examinations and for their general development. I am the committee's chairman, Paul Richards. At this time, I'd invite members of the committee to please introduce themselves, and we have expectation for all members to be with us, with the exception of Member Monroe, who has an emergency, starting with Member Ford.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. Good morning to the listening public. Also to all our executives that are with us this morning. Esmond Ford is the name, member of the committee. Member Beckles.
Yeah, good morning, Chair. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, Penelope Beckles, Member of Parliament, Minister of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Ndassing.
Good. Thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning to all the stakeholders who are present with us this morning. Jonathan Darrison, Member of Parliament for Couva South, and member of the committee. I look forward to a very fruitful period of interaction this morning.
Thank you, Member Ndassing. Member Sinanan.
Yes. Good morning, members. Rohan Sinanan, Minister of Books and Transport, member. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Avinash Singh is with us, but he'll be in and out. He's attending another conference concurrently, but we acknowledge his presence and he'll join us in process again. Member Nakid.
Good morning to all and to the viewing public, and welcome to our shareholders.
Thank you so much. And at this time, I'd like to invite members from the stakeholder groups with us today to introduce themselves and their teams, and also present to us a brief opening remark. Generally, it's usually 2 to 3 minutes maximum, starting with Mr. Claude McKellar, Acting Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation.
Good morning, Chair and members. Thank you very much for having us here today. I will be joined by Mr. Charles Bob Semple, who is currently our Head National Information and Communications Technology Division here at the Ministry. Would you like me to give the opening remarks at this time or after all the other persons have introduced themselves?
Yes, please. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Chairman and members of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration, thank you for inviting the Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation to participate in the committee's inquiry into the hybrid learning system on student performance in government and government-assisted schools during the revised COVID-19 restrictions. We welcome the opportunity given that the ministry's mandate includes digital transformation, bridging the digital divide, and improving access to and utilization of ICTs at the national level. Mindful of the restrictions that have been put in place to protect our nation's people, and more so our students, the ministry and its agencies have facilitated remote and blended learning through the following initiatives. One, the provision of additional spectrum to mobile providers, the rollout of TT Wi-Fi to additional locations across Trinidad and Tobago, and third, availability of ICT access centers in underserved communities. Furthermore, Chair, please be informed that the ministry, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and another agency, iGovTT, have been working directly with the Ministry of Education to ensure that students are provided with ICT-enabled devices, SIM cards, and TT Wi-Fi services at public schools that do not have internet access and those where the internet access service is below the required standard. The ministry is also engaging with the Ministry of Education on the development of that ministry's learning management system. Chair, in closing, I wish to assure you that the ministry's representatives undertake to support the committee's inquiry by responding as best as we can to your questions, excuse me, and subsequently providing any additional information that may be required. We also welcome any recommendations that this committee may proffer as a means of improving the ministry's ability to deliver on its mandate, particularly as it relates to the subject of today's meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Acting PS McKellar. We appreciate your opening commentary from the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation. Next, we go to the Chief Executive Officer of the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, TATT, Mrs. Cynthia Reddock-Downs.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Cynthia Reddock-Downs, Chief Executive Officer of the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. With me today is Mr. Kirk Supram, who is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the authority. The Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago commenced its operations of regulator of telecoms and broadcasting in July 2004, at a time when there was a virtual monopoly in telecommunication services, and with a mandate bestowed upon it by the Telecommunications Act, Chapter 4731. This mandate referred to the liberalization of the telecommunications and broadcasting sectors and included introducing fair competition, choice, new service offerings at affordable prices, and at the same time promoting and protecting the interests of the public by promoting access to telecommunication services, promoting universal service, protection of customers, and high standards of service provision. Today, it is a great pleasure and privilege to be asked to account to you, members of the Joint Select Committee, on elements of our stewardship, and in the presence of some of our concessionaires who have committed themselves to providing high-quality services to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. It should be noted that now we have 2 mobile providers with over 1.98 million subscriptions as at December 2020. We have 8 internet service providers with over 320,000 subscriptions. We have 15 broadcasters via cable, 5 free-to-air television broadcasters, and 37 radio stations. I look forward to our deliberations, and as we seek to improve the lives of our people, and particularly our children, in using ICTs in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reddock-Downs, CEO of TATT. We next move to the Chief Executive Officer Acting of TSTT, Ms. Lisa Agard. Ms. Agard.
Good morning, Chairman and other members of the committee, and good morning to the viewing and listening public of Trinidad and Tobago. TSTT has been part of the fabric of Trinidad and Tobago society for many years, and we are particularly proud of the role that we have played in this competitive environment to be part of the process that saw, when competition was introduced, fixed broadband penetration in Trinidad and Tobago moved from 34% at the inception of competition to where it is today at 84% of household penetration. That is in no small part due to the billions of dollars that TSTT and I would say other concessionaires in the market have invested in the development of ICT infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago. And not being so bold as to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I would say that as an industry, we have invested significantly. We have supported the government in its various initiatives during COVID-19 and otherwise, and we have played a significant role in advancing broadband infrastructure development, both on the fixed side and on the wireless side, such that today we can say with confidence as an industry, we reach over 95% of the population of Trinidad and Tobago with broadband capability, whether it be fixed or wireless. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Agard, who is the CEO of TSTT. Next, we move to the CEO of Digicel TT, Mr. Abraham Smith. Mr. Smith, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. I'm Abraham Smith, the CEO of Digicel Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm joined with Chandrika Samaru, our Chief Technical Officer. I thank you and the committee for the invitation to appear today. These are important discussions as we talk about improving the hybrid learning system here in Trinidad and Tobago. This month marks 15 years that Digicel has been part of the social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago. We've endeavored to do our part to keep people connected, entertained, supported, and we take that responsibility seriously. In the past 15 years, together with our industry colleagues, we've helped to transform the telecommunications market by taking the best global ideas and applying them here. In 2016, we made a deliberate decision to invest significantly to bring additional broadband infrastructure into the country. Since then, we've invested over $1.5 billion into the rollout of our fiber and mobile broadband networks to provide the best connectivity and service possible. Since that time, digitization, digital transformation, e-commerce, all of these buzzwords have come into place, and then COVID-19 hit. And these aspirations weren't aspirations anymore, but rather a forced reality. Within days of the events of last year, we rolled out a comprehensive support campaign to our customers. To date, we estimate that we've offered over $170 million of relief here in Trinidad and Tobago during this COVID-19 pandemic. It was recently expressed, no child left behind means no child left offline. And we want to ensure that this becomes a reality through the length and breadth of these two islands. As an industry, as my colleague said, we've worked to provide fixed connectivity to over 84% of households nationally and mobile coverage to over 98%. However, online education requires us to think about not only connecting those remaining households, but also devices, affordability, educational content, and the delivery of that content to effectively impact students. So the work of this committee and us as an industry is significant. And we look forward to today's hearing. We hope this will open new doors and new possibilities for collaboration and partnership between government and the other stakeholders here. And as we say at Digicel, we believe that this collaboration will make us better together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Appreciate your contribution. And last but by no means least, our country manager for Flow, Mr. Curly Prescott. Mr. Prescott.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, members of the committee. Good morning to the other participants on this working session. I'm joined this morning with our Industrious Director of Commercial Operations, Cindy Ann Gatt. So she's also on the call with us. And we are happy to make representation on behalf of Columbus Communications, Trinidad Limited, a subsidiary of Cable and Wireless across the region, as it pertains to how do we work together as an industry, government and industry players, to see how we can achieve every single child being able to access educational content despite the constraints that have been put on us in the pandemic. As our colleagues would have gone over, the accessibility of broadband infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago is significant. I would also want to add to the point that not only is the coverage reach significant, but the quality of the network infrastructure is one of the best, if not among the top 2 or 3 across the entire region. The type of speeds, the type of reliability, uptime is really among the top tier across the region and very competitive to what consumers have access to in the sort of so-called more developed countries and nations. And so we are proud to be a part of that drive to investment to bring the level of broadband infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago to such a competitive level. As it pertains to the specific pandemic, we have also been very proud of our efforts in this regard. And some of those efforts even preceded the pandemic, right? So our efforts partnering with initiatives such as Penku.com to promote online education and online learning has been going on for 12 years. And we're very, very happy to continue those efforts during these times where the need for online learning is accentuated. We've been happy to expand our services into new communities, new areas that did not have broadband access before during these times. We've been happy to deliver internet access connectivity as part of our corporate social responsibility to student support centers across the country so that those who may not have access at home can go to these student support centers and have internet access. We've been pleased to continue to provide devices to students to ensure that those who don't have the means to connect can have an option, can have an alternative, can have a vehicle by which they can continue their online learning. And we are very, very pleased and look forward to and invigorated in working together with this committee and the rest of our colleagues to see how we can continue these successes and grow our reach even further to touch every single one of our children across the nation. So we are hyped to be here, we are pumped to be here, and we're looking forward to the outcome of these deliberations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prescott. I'm really happy to hear all our telecom providers so fervently boasting of their quality of service and their reach in Trinidad and Tobago. Because I will tell you, the reason that we've gathered you esteemed people here before us today, because one of the consistent recurring themes that we have encountered, because this is our 4th inquiry, we've had several stakeholder groups covering the gamut of public schools, government-assisted schools, students with special needs, and stakeholders in all these regards. And the recurring theme that we've heard in the context of education in the pandemic issues with, and these are not exclusive to Trinidad and Tobago by any means, but of course we reside here, so we have to see what we can do to deal with the gaps. Issues related to devices and access to devices, which we, like every other country in the world, have faced because the pandemic basically forced life online, as it were, and education was not excluded from that. The other issues we faced included, in addition to devices, and an appropriate number of devices per household and per learner in the household, because we know that work situations went online at home, in addition to education situations, with in some cases more than one child or learner in the household having to need access to devices, is the issue of access to Wi-Fi and consistent quality Wi-Fi. Particularly in rural areas, there was significant levels of complaints, and the quality of Wi-Fi and consistency of Wi-Fi, and also the affordability factor and whether people in the lower socioeconomic demographics could actually afford the Wi-Fi, although many of the providers have indicated they provided special packages, etc. If you will permit me, I'd like to give some references to what has happened internationally. And the United Nations has long advocated that education is a right. And in the context of the pandemic, education being a right has to be taken in the context of access to education under pandemic conditions, which means if you don't have a device or you don't have consistent Wi-Fi or you can't afford Wi-Fi, you have no education. So your right is being infringed upon. So while we may have had systems that may have worked before, certainly our systems and our standards and our parameters would have had to change during the pandemic to equal the playing field, to ensure that every student, particularly those in vulnerable situations, have access to education. Otherwise, their rights are being infringed. And a quote from 3 main articles as we start this morning. One is from a group called Save the Children. It is dated the 2nd of March, 2021. And it's a response to the global humanitarian responses to COVID-19. And I quote, "A year into the COVID-19 pandemic, children across the world have lost an average of 74 days of education, each due to school closures or a lack of access to remote learning." 74 days. This is since the start of the pandemic. Save the Children said more than 1/3 of the standard of global 190-day school year. So 74 days out of the average 190 school day. In total, an estimation of 112 billion days of education have been lost altogether. 112 billion days of education, with the world's poorest children being disproportionately affected. New analyses by the Child Rights Organization of the data of 194 countries in different regions across the globe shows that children in Latin America and the Caribbean and South Asia missed out on almost triple the education of children in Western Europe. That's us. Broken down at regional levels, the difference in lost days in education becomes painfully clear. Save the Children went on to say, both in Latin America and the Caribbean and South Asia, children went through around 110 days without any education. Children in the Middle East lost 80 days. Children in Sub-Saharan Africa lost an average of 69 days. In East Asia and the Pacific, lost an average of 47 days. In Europe and Central Asia, lost an average of 45 days. In Western Europe alone, it was 38 days. So in the Caribbean, Latin America, and South Asia, 110 days, the largest number of days lost due to either no access to education or no devices. Another document, which is a policy brief, Education During COVID-19 and Beyond, stated that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused the largest disruption in education in history, having already had a near universal impact on learners and teachers around the world. From pre-primary to secondary, technical and vocational and training institutions, universities, adult learning, and skills and development establishment. By mid-April 2020, 94% of learners worldwide were affected by the pandemic, representing 1.58 billion children, from primary to higher education in over 200 countries. Primarily because of an inability to access devices, Wi-Fi, or an inability to afford these devices. So again, That's why you goodly people are here. And finally, from the Economic Policy Institute with an article titled COVID-19 and Student Performance, Equity and U.S. Education Policy, Lessons from Pre-Pandemic Research to Inform Relief, Recovery and Rebuilding. It is by Emma Garcia and Elaine Weiss, September 10th, 2020. Pandemic Relevant Research offers key lessons as education systems respond to the coronavirus crisis. And I'll just quote two of the main headings of a very voluminous document. Research regarding online learning and teaching shows that they are effective only if students have consistent access to the internet and computers, and if teachers have received targeted training, support for online instructions and access and devices themselves. Research on chronic absenteeism and on remote learning reinforces the urgency of providing appropriate support to children who are at least prepared to and have access to devices, and those at a risk of becoming disengaged and eventually dropping out. And it goes on to talk about the difference in engagement between on a telephone or a cell phone and a computer, because they are largely different in terms of how they engage students. So I just wanted to set the context to what the kind of significant challenges that students are facing around the world, and in particular, students in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So if I could start by directing the first question to Mrs. Cynthia Reddock Downs of TATT. In the STS papers you provided, you indicated that TATT would have started Universal Service Initiative project. Could you give us a sense of the feedback, Mrs. Downs, that you've received, if you have that data, from internet users in the country, and the challenges that would have been encountered in switching education and other sectors to an online environment at the start of the pandemic, and certainly into the first 6 months of the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Certainly in the first 6 months of the pandemic, what we sought to do was to, first of all, as I said earlier, to provide as far as possible additional spectrum to ensure that the services that were provided online could meet the capacity requirements of the general public, and in particular the schools as well. Now, since that time, we have had other initiatives as well. So, for example, we have had a universal service initiative to provide devices for students of public schools. And so far, with those, the allocation of those devices, we understand that the feedback has been positive. As a matter of fact, I think over 6,000 of those devices have already been distributed to schools and to principals, and the response has been good, because what it means now is that those students who originally, as we said earlier, where you would have had perhaps just one mobile phone to an entire household, students within families would now each have their own device and are therefore able to access the services, the online educational services available.
In terms of the usage in Trinidad and Tobago, would you have had a sense of the gaps that exist? Because our feedback from the stakeholders in our first 3 inquiries was profound, to say the least, in terms of the gaps in particularly rural areas. And while the stakeholders who are with us today, and we certainly will have questions from them later on, have indicated their coverage was 90 and 95%, that has not been our feedback at all. And there have been significant questions about the quality and consistency of service provided, particularly in rural areas in Trinidad and Tobago.
For us, certainly the pandemic highlighted a few things. One of them is affordability issues. I think, even where the coverage is particularly good or available, what we found is that several households were unable to access the coverage, access the facilities, because they just could not afford them. And, at the authority, what we've tried to do is to think about how we could design initiatives and projects to address that particular situation. And we've turned to a great extent to our Universal Service Fund, try to see how we could provide or reduce that gap for those who cannot afford to have devices or to pay for the access that's required. So you're right, in terms of affordability, we found that that was much more significant than we originally thought. In terms of gaps in connectivity, we also found that there were areas that were underserved, meaning that even though they had some services, they did not have the services at the standard that was required to support the education services. And as such, we've also tried to design universal service projects that will address the underserved aspect of the connectivity in those locations. So yes, we have found that there are gaps, and those gaps were perhaps more significant than we recognize, and it was largely because of the underserved element, not the fact that the area was not served at all.
And finally, before I move to the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation, in terms of your Universal Services project, which targeted persons who were visually and hearing impaired, we've had several, in our last inquiry, a wide gamut of groups that service persons with special needs and disabilities, and they've relayed some really disturbing and profound gaps indeed. What has the outcome been of this initiative where you're concerned? It's a project, so it's not a policy. And are there plans for expansion to the wider community of persons with learning disabilities and special needs, because they have rights to education also?
That's correct. In the end, it's about not leaving anyone behind. Certainly, our project to provide subsidies for persons with disabilities initially has targeted those persons with hearing impairments and visual impairments. And we also initially targeted children between the ages of 12 and 18 years. We have had some measure of take-up, but certainly not at the levels that we expected to have. And so what we've done is that we've actually extended the program to children from age 5 upwards with the approval of their parents to also have access to the subsidy for the persons with disabilities. It is our intention as well to look at persons with other types of disabilities, because in the end, as you have said, and which is quite accurate, there are a number of persons with disabilities who do not have access to ICTs, and it's our intention that as far as we possibly can, those who cannot afford to have that access, we assist in doing so. So far, the take-up has been, we have had take-up, we have had enthusiastic persons actually making themselves available for the subsidy. However, we do intend to extend the initiative further to make sure that it addresses the needs of all our persons with disabilities.
Member Ndassing has a question. Go ahead, Member Ndassing, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. To the CEO of TATT, if I could recollect, and based on your submission that TATT signed an MOU with the Ministry of Education on the 23rd of October 2020 to provide approximately 10,000 devices. Could you indicate to this committee what is the status of this MOU?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ndassing. The MOU was signed with the Ministry of Education to make sure that the services that we were providing to public schools met the needs of the ministry and of the student population generally. We have provided all the devices that we agreed to provide via our 2 partners in the project, and the partners were TSTT, Bmobile, and Digicel, who ably assisted us in making sure that those devices came to Trinidad and Tobago as soon as possible. I mean, certainly at the time, it was a difficult time for actually receiving such a large number of devices, since devices were required throughout the world at that time, in large quantities. So they were able to procure the devices for us in very short order and make them available to us together with SIM cards and connectivity for an initial period of 3 months. What has happened recently is that the authority has agreed to provide those devices with connectivity up until the end of the current school term. So we will be extending the connectivity for students from public schools, not only for 3 months now, but essentially for a period of about 6 months to make sure that they are able to access education and the educational platforms and services available to them for them to attend school. I can tell you that looking at the information that has been provided from the Ministry of Education that was required under the MOU, we have seen that the devices have been distributed throughout Trinidad to many, many schools in Trinidad of all various denominations, government schools, and so on. And when we last got information from the ministry, we had information on the distribution of about 6,000 to 7,000 devices. There are still some devices to be given out, and in my view, based on the discussions we had with the ministry recently, those should be given out within the next week, couple of weeks. It's not actually going to be much longer than that. And so we are very, we are happy with the success of the MOU so far, and the fact that we are able to provide devices to families and children of public schools who do not have that facility available to them earlier in the year. Discussions with the Ministry of Education started in April of last year when they approached us and recognizing that there were deficiencies with regard to devices and deficiencies with regard to connectivity at their schools. And so after numerous discussions and so on, and trying to get to see what we could do in the soonest possible time to alleviate the situation, we felt that initially devices, because at that time there was a gap, the ministry had a gap of perhaps about 68,000 devices at the time. And in addition to requesting members of the public and the commercial enterprises or organizations to assist, we felt it was important that the authority make devices also available, because in the end, it's not only about connectivity, it's also about having the devices so that you can connect. And it's also about, if you cannot afford to have a device, then you should have one to be able to access the education system. And in our view, and certainly based on the information that we have, which arose from the MOU, we are fairly satisfied with what we've done so far with the Ministry of Education.
Thank you. One of the
as a follow-up, Chairman.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Chairman, so out of the initial MOU, after 13 months into the pandemic, we have not distributed the full 10,000, if I could get that clear. And additionally, this committee has been provided with information, I think, about between 35 to 36,000 students are without devices. Does the Trinidad and Tobago Telecom Authority intend to pursue further MOU with the Ministry of Education to try and reduce this gap in terms of device or the lack of devices which are existing out there in relation to students within the education system?
Is that question for Mrs. Reddock Downs, Member Dassing?
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dassing. What we have done so far is that we've provided the 10,000 devices to the Ministry of Education. We do not have any plans at this time to add any more devices. However, what we are also doing is, and again, in consultation with the Ministry of Education, is that we are providing Wi-Fi at schools. And this Wi-Fi at schools is intended to bring blending learning, make available the blending learning that's required at this time. We, in consultation and discussion with service providers, we have, and the Ministry of Education, they have provided us with a list of schools that are requiring internet access, and also those that do not have internet access to the standard required. And so we're currently working with service providers to make sure that we can provide the Wi-Fi that's required at the public schools, and at the same time make sure that where it's already provided, the standard of Wi-Fi and the ability of students to access the internet is at the required level.
Thank you. I want to move the question now to Mr. McKellar, the Permanent Secretary acting in the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation. Mr. McKellar, can you give us a sense of if the ministry has done an assessment of the digital space in Trinidad and Tobago, given that we've had to in an emergency manner, translate to working online education, and what presently are the gaps that exists in terms of devices, and also after that, moving to your project related to access centers, and give us an overview of that and where that project is as it stands in terms of access in particularly rural areas.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the assessment of the digital space, as you put it, the ministry for itself has not conducted such an assessment, but we would rely heavily upon our agency, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. As you may be aware, the authority has currently embarked on its Digital Inclusion Survey 2021, which would provide a lot of the information that would speak to the level of coverage that exists nationally across Trinidad and Tobago. So we would rely on TATT in that regard. We would also be relying upon information from the Ministry of Education as it relates to children and the extent to which they have connectivity, whether it's at their homes, connectivity at schools, and other agencies. So there's connectivity, and there's also the issue of devices. I think Member Indar Singh mentioned just now 35,000 students still without devices. So while the ministry for itself hasn't embarked upon such a study, we are relying upon our agencies and others to provide us with that information and take the appropriate measures.
Thank you. And the access centers,
right,
in terms of Marak, Guayari, Kumana, Pinal, Caranaj, Todd's Road, etc. First of all, what was the metrics used for deciding on these areas to start with? Was there an assessment done, a field survey, etc.? And what's the intention of these access centers, and how far has the project reached?
Okay, so again, the initiative to establish and roll out the ICT access centers was intended to provide access in those, as we describe it, underserved communities. So the current locations would have been based really upon an earlier digital divide or digital inclusion survey that TATT had commissioned some years ago. So the decision is based upon empirical evidence in terms of those communities where access to internet, Wi-Fi, a wide range of ICT services are not available. So clearly the 6 operational centers were based on the results of the ICT, the digital divide survey.
Before I move to
Chairman, could I ask when this digital divide survey was initiated and completed?
Yes. Thank you, member. Through your chair, I think the last survey that was done prior to the one currently being undertaken by TATT and CSO was in 2014. The ICT access centers, I believe, have been in operation since 2015.
Certainly, Chairman, if I could recommend, because I think that given the fact of what we have heard from the PS, this needs to be reviewed because, for example, I think that there is the need probably to increase the number of access centers. And I also heard, and I'm using it in the context of, and I will not name because I know school principals might get into trouble, but yesterday a school principal called me in my constituency to tell me that she has given up on the Ministry of Education in terms of providing internet and connectivity to the school. And she asked me if I could intervene and try and get one of the service providers to provide that sense of connectivity for the benefit of the stakeholders in the school. And this is why I am saying that there needs to be a review and probably increasing access in terms of connectivity. And also, I heard when the CEO of TATT was speaking that they were charged with the responsibility of the provision of Wi-Fi and connectivity in schools. 13 months into the pandemic, I am saying that while we are hearing all the mantras of leaving no child behind, children are indeed being left behind, and they are in a state of wilderness at the moment in terms of their educational development.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Keller.
Yeah, just a slight thing on that. The issue of the Wi-Fi in schools, but to my knowledge, schools are churning out of schools. So I think the major concern should be the connectivity surrounding the schools to ensure that the homes have the access. So I just need to get that clarified in terms of, why we placing so much emphasis on the school building itself having the internet access and not necessarily the communities, the community centers, the village councils, the sports clubs. And I think those are the areas that we need to place the emphasis on. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, I think it works both ways. I think because there are some categories, I think standard 5 students and forms 4 and 5 and 6 are back in school. So the schools, some schools also need internet access. But I want to ask Mr. McKellar also, if there is a particular strategy involved in working with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, because it can't be an ad hoc, this ministry doing this ministry doing this. I'm presuming that because you're the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation, you may be the nexus ministry to determine what the needs are, where the gaps lie, and devise some sort of policy and plan in terms of using the data that you have to say, well, this area needs an access center, these schools have access, or these schools have connectivity. And if you actually have that information at this moment from your partner ministries.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just to go back a bit to an earlier point that was raised by Member Indar Singh, where he spoke to the need for more access centers. I would just want to indicate that in our response, we did advise the committee that we do intend to roll out a further 13 ICT access centers across Trinidad and Tobago during the course of the current fiscal, 8 to be rolled out by the ministry itself, and 5 through TATT, utilizing TATT's Universal Service Fund. Of course, as the
what areas are they going to be? Do you have the information as to what areas they're going to be in, these 13?
As far as the 8 that the ministry intends to roll out, I could give you the locations for 3, which should be in short order before June. We are looking at Betham Gardens, La Pastora, Santa Cruz, and La Joqueta. Under TATT will be rolling out Lopino, a center in Lopino, one in Toco, another in Roxborough, Moruga, and Fifth Company. Another 5 locations that would make up the MPADT's 8 would be identified in due course. But again, we are continuing to work with TATT and to look at the outcomes of the Digital Inclusion Survey to be more precise in terms of the areas of need. Yeah.
And are the ones in Kumana, Guayari, Marak, Pinal, Caranage, and Todd's Road fully operational at this time?
They are fully operational. As per our response to the committee's written request for responses, we did indicate that I think at the Todd's Road Center, there is currently no Wi-Fi patio. That is to say, there is internet connectivity within the center, but as far as the external patios, we don't have Wi-Fi, but we do intend to address that in short order.
Member Beckles?
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much, Chair. And just to follow up on a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, which really has to do with the issue of data collection as it relates to the usage of the internet. I know that I got some information from Digicel that spoke of 84 and 98% respectively. But my main concern is two issues. Is there a policy as it relates to any set of special packages for persons with disabilities? And the issue of the rural communities, what sort of reach in an actual sense, based on your research and analysis and feedback? I mean, I can talk of some of my communities in the North Coast that really do not have good internet access. And the last thing is the issue of broadband connectivity, particularly for rural communities.
This is to Digicel and TSTT, right?
Yes, please.
So if we could start with Ms. Agard on that. Good morning again, Ms. Agard.
Right. So good morning again, Chairman, and members of the committee. So I have listened to concerns expressed by you, Chairman, and other members on the committee in relation to complaints about broadband coverage in Trinidad and Tobago. Based on work that was done by the industry as part of the roadmap to recovery, we looked at collectively at our various serving technologies and networks in Trinidad and Tobago. And on the basis of that work that we did, not any government agency, we determined that we have 95% broadband coverage, geographic coverage in Trinidad and Tobago. So when we speak to, on the basis of the analysis that we did,
just for clarity, Ms. Agard, what does that mean, 95% broadband coverage? Is it a geographical 95%? Is it a population 95%? Could you break it down for us?
Population coverage, right?
95%
so where people
of 1.4 million people, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So when we looked at the analysis that we had done, we determined that there were 3 communities that did not have broadband access. They were Bonaventure, Laloon, and Sacas. Right? So that was our analysis. This is not as a consequence of any digital divide survey. This was us collectively looking at the various networks that we have deployed in Trinidad and Tobago. So what is interesting is that notwithstanding, sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if somebody is everybody on mute?
Go ahead.
So what is interesting, Chairman, that when you look at the broadband subscription uptake on the fixed side, and I'll speak to the mobile side in a little bit, it is 84% uptake of households. So 80% of the 401,000 households in Trinidad and Tobago have high-speed broadband internet access, right? So that speaks to speeds of 10 megs or more. So there's a gap between take-up and coverage. So in other words, so while we have 95% broadband coverage by population, you're only seeing 84% take up, which speaks to clearly an affordability issue, right? So it is clear that some families are challenged in relation to be able to access the networks that are available to such families. On the mobile side, I did not hear the CEO of TATT speak to this, but in terms of mobile internet uptake, that is currently 55% of the population. So while we have 1.9 million subscribers, which gives us a penetration of 144, 55% of every 100 people in the country have internet access or data capability on their mobile devices. These are significant penetration levels. And let me just say, for the purposes of this committee and for anyone who's listening, these broadband penetration levels in terms of subscription uptake is among the highest in the Caribbean and compares quite favorably to that which exists in the so-called first world countries. But let me speak specifically to, as well, Chairman, if you'll give me an opportunity, to talk to a specific project that the major providers, along with other key stakeholders, including MASI and PBS Technologies, has embarked on.
Could I ask you, because I want to follow on a question based on information, and we welcome the information that you're giving us here. When you say you have 80% of the 95% coverage in household access, could you give us a sense of, if you have data pointing to the level of increase in usage between March 2020 and March 2021 in terms of how we can quantify the difference in us moving online and the uptick in digital service use in your customer base?
Okay, so what I have the year-on-year increases. I don't know if TATT could speak to the quarter-on-quarter increases, because there's always a lag with the supply of data from TATT. So the last data we have goes only to December 2020. And I could speak to, as of December 2020, with 351,900 fixed broadband subscriptions, that represents a 2.9% increase versus the prior year. So as of December 2019, between December 2019 and December 2020, there was a 2.9% increase, year-on-year increase, in terms of fixed broadband subscription uptake.
Just before you go into your project, so that we don't lose trend of thought here, I'd like to go to Mr. Smith to give us a sense of his company's, that's Digicel's, assessment of, so we can compare apples to apples, of what the coverage is, their customer base has been in terms of the provision for the pandemic. So, Mr. Smith.
Sure, thank you. Ms. Agard, I think, accurately communicated what's happening in the industry. That 84% of households do have fixed, and just over 50% of subscriptions are regularly accessing mobile internet. On our customer, to speak to what we've seen in our customer base over this past year, we've definitely seen growth of consumption. And Chandrika, perhaps you could relate what we've seen in terms of subscriber and traffic growth over that year.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Smith. We have seen on our network an increase in usage for the fixed network of 56% in the last 12 months. And our mobile network, a top line increase in usage of about 64%. When you drill it down to a per user perspective, we've seen that our data users on the mobile network has grown by about 18 to 20% per user. This is their usage. And on the fixed network, a 47% increase in usage. So we see a lot more activity happening for many activities across the day on those networks.
And that's primarily driven by the video consuming applications that folks are using for education and work.
So my next question is not meant to be vulgar in any way. You all are making more money.
That's not entirely accurate. So
okay, well, maybe that you're providing services at a lower cost.
Not true at all, sir.
So if I could, if you observe how, and it's consistent across the three providers here, especially if you look at the fixed side and even the mobile packages that people use, the volume of consumption isn't how folks are charged. So people are using more of the allotments that they receive inside of their packages. So the fixed home services, for example, that increase in consumption by users was not accompanied with any increase in revenue. I'm
glad you all cleared that up. Ms. Agad, thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Ms. Agad, you're going to talk about a project, and then we go to Member Naked on his question. So, Ms. Agad, you can continue, and then Member Naked, you can pose your questions, please.
Thank you so very much. And let me add, from the perspective, we have also seen a significant increase in data usage, both on our fixed and on our mobile network. In fact, we invested significantly in additional subsea capacity, which would give us more access to the World Wide Web. So our experience in terms of increasing internet usage is very similar to that of Digicel. So, but let me come to our low-income household internet provision project. So as part of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee, we had worked with some stakeholder groups, including the Archdiocese in Port of Spain, looking at this whole question of access to devices and internet access for low-income households. As a result of extensive discussions with key stakeholders, including the Ministry of Education, the three major operators, my colleagues, Digicel and Columbus Communications Flow, have come up with an offer for such low-income households of a $100 package, VAT inclusive, allowing a 15 meg download speed to 6,000 households. So we will split the households, 2,000 TSTT, 2,000 Digicel, 2,000 Flow. And we are currently working with the Ministry of Education, who is in the process of doing a means test for those students based on their informal survey have indicated that they do not have internet access at their homes. We are literally about to launch it. So the two key stakeholder groups are the Ministry of Education and the Catholic Archdiocese, acting as coordinator with other denominational schools. So we have received from them a list of students at their schools who have indicated that they do not have internet access at home. So in addition to all of the other things that we have done as a specific response to COVID, including increased investment in our networks to expand our internet capability, we are also about to launch this particular project. We have participated in the devices program with TATT. We have also participated in various Wi-Fi initiatives, and the other product that we launched last year, along with our colleagues at Digicel, is what we call a Be Productive mobile plan, which is at $149, $167 VAT inclusive, which is designed specifically for students. And it's a 30-day plan with 5 gigs of data and 1,800 on-net minutes and free access to certain platforms like Zoom, etc., to facilitate remote learning. So I think as an industry, we have more than responded in a very responsible way to the demands of our customers as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Before I go to Member Beckles, if you could put a pin there, Mr. Egad, I inadvertently forgot to give Mr. Prescott a chance to give his company, Flo's, perspective on the same question in terms of customer base and usage during the period in consideration. So I apologize, Mr. Prescott. And then we'll go back to Member Beckles and then Member Naked. So go ahead, Mr. Prescott, please.
Hi, thank you, Chairman. But I'd like really to add to what my colleagues would have shared. Yes, internet usage grew dramatically during the period. Ours was roughly around 40%. Of course, we're on the fixed side, so we don't have a mobile network. So we only have on the fixed broadband side. We'd have seen that increases. And as Abraham from Digicel would have articulated, our packages aren't based on how many megabytes or gigabytes you download. It's your monthly fee regardless, right? And what we've had to do to allow customers to operate at home, we've even had to increase package speeds. We've actually, if a customer had a 50 meg package or 75 meg package, we've had to increase that package speed to 100 megs so that the performance would be more in line with what they need at no additional price. So it has not been at all, Mr. Chairman, a revenue increase game. It has really been about absorbing a lot of increased demand from our customers and, working with our customers during these very, very difficult economic times to ensure that they could continue to work and study at home.
Thank you. While I appreciate all that everyone has said, there are jurisdictions around the world that have really, and all jurisdictions would tell you, the one sector that has grown significantly in the pandemic is the ICT sector and the internet provision sector and the technology sector. And those companies that are so grounded have seen significant growth in many different ways because their customer base now has to depend on online services more than ever before, and the world is more than likely not going to go back to what it was before if these companies are as innovative as they usually are. So I think there's room also for an understanding that, well, this is a social imperative.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Mr. Chair, but you have to put that into context in relation to what was the broadband penetration prior to the pandemic. So as Mr. Ika would have mentioned, Trinidad's broadband penetration was already over 80% prior to the pandemic onset, right? So there's not much room to grow outside of those who can't afford, right? It's not as if there are other markets and other jurisdictions where the pre-pandemic penetration of fixed broadband might have been 40, 45, 50%. So they had room to grow to 70, 75, 80% penetration. But because of the level of competitiveness in Trinidad and Tobago, the penetrations were already at 80%, right? Most of homes, well over 90% of the homes had access. Now, I do agree with the concerns of the other member embarrassing and so on. We do have to focus on that 5% who don't, right? So I don't want us to forget the 5% who don't have access because we shout about the 95% that do, right? So I do appreciate that. But in the 95% that do have access, as I said, well over 80% of them already had service. So there really wasn't that much room to grow to see that sort of phenomenal growth that other jurisdictions may have observed. And of course, I open the floor to my colleagues to, disagree or add to that as they see.
Well, I'll add one thing to that. While you may have had a significantly high penetration percentage of 80%, in other jurisdictions, what we've seen is those who have had internet services have bumped up their packages significantly when they could afford it. So that added to the coffers in those jurisdictions. I don't know if that's the case in Trinidad and Tobago. Member Beckles. Member Naked, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you much, Chair. I really want to get back to an issue that's very important for me, and that is the issue of the whilst we talk about 90% broadband connectivity 90% broadband, and in relation to internet, 95%, if I'm correct. Can I really get an appreciation as to what happens in the North Coast areas? And I'm being very specific. The areas of Blanchishes, Paria, Monlacqua, Heights of Aripo, and Wallerfield for both Digicel and Bmobile, where the farmers are complaining that, I mean, they simply are not getting much internet access. Can I ask specifically for those communities, please?
Can I start with Mr. Egal on that, please?
Mr. Chairman, and as they are saying that they can include the Cora Valley, Mount St. Benedict, St. John Road, and the Maracas Valley. Thank you.
So we've gone from northeast to north central and east now. So
we still in the northern range. We still in the northern range.
I know we're in the northern range, but you see the gamut we've gone to while we're talking about 95%. Mr. Egad, could you start, please? Thank you.
Okay, so I am going to ask my CTO, Mr. Kenrick Garcia, to respond to the issues in relation to those specific areas. Because remember, I think the question was being asked, one mobile coverage and one broadband coverage, whether it's a WTTX network or fixed network. So Kenrick?
Hi, morning everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. So in the North Coast area specifically, what we did is this. As part of the deployment of our new 700 spectrum, we would have specifically targeted the North Coast area. We have seen, I would think, maybe more than 100% improvement in the service in that area, because we would have supplied some of the maps, Mr. Chairman, to you guys as to what the service is in that area, so you could see a significant improvement. And we've also coupled that, what we also did, we ran a significant amount of fiber to take up all those locations on the North Coast to ensure that we could actually improve the speeds, etc., in that whole area. Are there some gaps still remaining in the area? The answer to that question is yes. And by and large, the issues we have in there, because mobile signal is susceptible to things like the terrain, these types of issues has perennially been the major issues in some of these areas. However, we also in that area have been suffering a lot of commercial power outages. So what we've been doing is this. We have backup power. We normally will cater between 4 to 8 hours on our mobile locations as it relates to that. However, what we've been seeing, power outages, again, it might be just because of shared locations, the crew to get there, do the repairs from a commercial standpoint. We have plenty of the issues there is because the power outage goes beyond the life of the battery. So as a result, the site will go down, people will suffer some of that type of degradation in the mobile coverage.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, from your perspective.
Certainly, and I'll let again. I'll turn to Chandrika Samaru to answer both what we've done during COVID, what our plans are, and as Mr. Prescott said, absolutely, we recognize that there's still gaps in coverage, both on broadband and mobile, and and our ability to affordably deliver that coverage is what we're trying to solve. Chandrika.
Sure. So like Mr. Smith mentioned, we do recognize that there are gaps, not just in the North Coast, but in Central, as was mentioned as well. And these will be reflected in the maps that we have submitted to you that adequately demonstrates our coverage. Even before the onset of the pandemic, Digicel would have deployed an LTE network across the entire country. And we did that on a capacity band of spectrum, right? Our 1900 spectrum. During the pandemic, we augmented that network with the temporary spectrum that was awarded by TATT. And we also deployed our 700 megahertz LTE network, which offers a lot better coverage due to its physical properties across the country. In the North and Central specifically, we do have both a 1900 and a 700 megahertz presence. And we are incrementally upgrading during the course of the next 12 months to try to get 700 megahertz spectrum on as many sites as possible. We are also, sorry, Chair, we are also looking at, as Mr. Smith mentioned, innovative ways to address the cost to serve challenge that we see, because for many factors, the number of sites and site densities required to extend our infrastructure to these areas are quite expensive, and they're not sustainable from a financial perspective to keep extending network coverage in that way. So alternative solutions are required, and we are investigating that with our providers to be able to explore those over the next 12 months as well.
Thank you. Member Nakid.
Thank you, Chairman. To Mrs. Agard and to Mr. Smith, how reliant are those two organizations on information from TATT? Since we've heard about their TATT's last survey, I think 2014, and some measure of implementation in 2015, if I'm correct. And what is the synergy possibly between TATT and those organizations? Because the figures, obviously, that we've heard, 95%, 98%, as you stated, Chairman, does not reflect what we've seen on the ground, judging by some of the places that have been mentioned already, and some that I could probably mention. So what kind of synergy and how reliant are they, those organizations, on TATT?
Start with Ms. Agard, please. You're still muted.
Sorry, I do apologize, Chairman. So as an industry, we are heavily reliant on information provided by TATT in the quarterly market surveys to give us an industry perspective as to where we are. So the last quarterly TATT survey covers the period to December 2020. There's always a bit of a lag between data sets provided and the information provided by TATT. And you are correct, the last digital divide survey was done, as I think the PS indicated, in 2013, 2014. So that survey would provide definitive information on where there may be access gaps in the country, where there is no internet service, or where there are unserved communities. Because I think as an industry, we cannot proceed on anecdotal evidence. We need to have definitive information. So we particularly look forward because of the current survey being undertaken by TATT, which might identify additional unserved communities or unserved communities that is outside of our purview.
Well, Mrs. Agard, 1 second. Since you just appropriately stated that since 2013, 2014, that's a 7-year gap that there's not been any update. Obviously that doesn't help you. It doesn't help your organization to adequately fill. And I know you cannot depend on something that's anecdotal, but there must be some kind of synergy between your organization, since apparently you seem to be doing well, although you said no, you're not doing well, but there has been some profit being made. You're not here to lose money. So having said that, can there be some synergy, since we know the snail pace of possibly TATT, and that I said that with all respect, but there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect, and pun intended, there's a disconnect. And maybe if there's some synergy in getting that data up to date, it would help.
Member Nakid, let me help you. Let me just bring in Mrs. Reddock Downs, and we can clear up why there was a gap. And she also indicated that there is a survey on the ground at the moment. Mrs. Reddock Downs, please intervene.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The last digital divide survey was in fact completed during the period 2013-2014. What we've done since that time is that we have collected information from service providers on where, in their view, the coverage requirements, their coverage is at the moment. And we've taken that information that has come in from service providers and we've mapped that on the GIS to indicate where gaps are. So in between the period 2013 to 2020, we have actually got information from service providers. And of course, we do go out and physically verify this information as well. We have collected information from service providers regarding their coverage. We do have a lot of information that has come in and that we've superimposed on the GIS to indicate where the gaps are. In 2021, we have started a new survey, which is called the Digital Inclusion Survey, and that survey seeks to measure the digital divide, but also it seeks to identify those persons who are not using ICTs. It also identifies those persons who require more skills to be able to access, and also it tells us about the gap, the affordability gap as well, because as I mentioned earlier, what the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us is that the gap between affordability and accessibility is much greater than we expected. And so we hope to get this information that started on the 17th of April. Tell us where these population issues are with regard to both connectivity and affordability. And in this way, we will be able to find out the population groups that are most at risk from being left behind at this time. So even though there was a period of about 6 or 7 years between the last surveys, we have a considerable amount of information from the service providers that we've been able to use to identify areas where we can have a meaningful service provider.
Well, don't you see that could be problematic, Mrs. Brown? Don't you see that could be problematic? The service providers would not tell you of areas where there's the possibility of them losing money in terms of how that the cost profit would balance would affect them. They would not go into areas that it would cause them to set up on all their digital equipment and so forth and so on. And they would not make money in those areas, but we would have citizens affected. So how could you rely on the service providers to give you that information?
Okay, if I may as well, Mr. Chair. The authority also has a responsibility to provide services or to make sure that persons in areas where it may be uneconomical for service providers to operate, we also have a responsibility to make sure that those areas are served. And that is why, based on the information we receive from service providers, we've been able to identify areas where we can immediately start to initiate projects. Those are gaps. So, for example, the authority is about to embark on projects together with service providers in areas that we know are based on the information we're having and also from complaints, because people do tell us. People do come to tell us the areas that they don't have service. So in fact, we have a project that will be coming up very shortly to address the area of Basso Amado, Dos Santos, the St. John's Road in Tobago, and other areas that we've identified based on the submission of service providers and the public members of the public. Based on that information, we have designed projects that we will be introducing very shortly to bring connectivity to those areas. And those areas would have been areas that have been recognized as possibly areas that may have been uneconomical to serve, but at the same time, it's the authority's responsibility to make sure that those areas are served.
Thank you. Just before I go back to member endorsing, I want to bring in Mr. McKellar, the acting PS in the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation. Now, a lot of the conversation in the last couple of minutes has focused on those vulnerable areas and those gaps members Beckles and member Ford identified, and the stakeholders responded about the gaps in that North Coast area. But from where you sit as the acting PS in the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation, what kind of, the operative word here being digital transformation, what are the transformative initiatives that we can see in the next 2-3 quarters in Trinidad and Tobago that the ministry has envisioned to deal with these gaps of access and Wi-Fi access and the possible impact on the lives of those citizens in the education sector and by extension social services provision, etc., because they are significantly linked. You can't have, even if you have access to Wi-Fi and connectivity and you don't have food and water, you're going to have some issues.
Thank you, Chair. Excellent question. And it's one that really falls squarely within our remit, although it's not only for us to address. Okay, so as far as the digital transformation is concerned, right now a lot of our efforts are geared towards the digital transformation of the public service. So, for example, that focuses heavily on the provision of many of government services, or as many of the government services as possible, online, so that citizens do not have to visit a physical office to access services. Services are being made available online. To that end, there are 3 ministries, 3 sectors that have been identified for particular attention. One, obviously, is the Ministry of Education, to provide and ensure that all students at all levels have access to online learning facilities. The third sector or ministry would be the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, as a key ministry that provides services to the less fortunate, the disadvantaged. We are also looking at that ministry, and I believe they are working closely with one of our agencies under the ministry, iGovTT, to design and develop systems that would allow greater provision of services via online mechanisms. The third ministry sector under consideration or prioritized has been the Ministry of Health, particularly with respect to access and sharing of information between health institutions. So, for example, if somebody accessed a service at a health center or a hospital in San Fernando some time ago and they had cause to visit another center in Arima, there would be easy flow of records between the centers. So those 3 have been particularly targeted for initial attention. More specifically, sorry.
The next question I have for you is, and it will be translated to Ms. Agard and Mr. Smith and Mr. Prescott, is the issue of, we are 13 months into the pandemic now, and a lot of the emphasis has been placed on the Wi-Fi access, the provision of services, and very importantly, devices. What has been happening in other jurisdictions is, while there has been the acquisition of devices, there has been an omission of the servicing of those and maintenance of those devices. And what the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation's policy is in terms of liaising with education and stakeholders, and I guess TATT, in terms of not having a junkyard end up in the country where we have to order more devices in 6 months because we have not had a maintenance and schedule for devices that we've acquired and devices that existed in the country, and also transitioning devices into newer technologies as technologies become available to access different levels of service in the next couple of years.
Okay, while the ministry itself may not have been the one to develop, for example, the standards and the specs for the laptops and the tablets that would have been acquired, that would have been done between TATT, iGovTT, and the Ministry of Education. But I'm pretty confident that the specs and standards that would have been developed for the initial acquisitions and those to come would have taken into consideration that they are being utilized by students, the kinds of rigor, the kinds of wear and tear that those devices are likely to be put through, and therefore the acquisitions would have been to suit. Yeah, but I think that I would defer to CEO TATT to speak a little more on that.
Thank you, Mrs. Reddock Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. regarding the devices that we've provided, as part of the MOU between ourselves and the Ministry of Education, there is a warranty, a manufacturer's warranty, and the devices, if there are any difficulties with it during the period of use, they can be repaired or replaced in that regard. And we are aware that spares have actually been brought in by both service providers. So in the event that the devices need to be replaced before the end of their useful life, that those additional devices are available from both service providers, Digicel and TSTT. We have user agreements with the families, with the Ministry of Education, where the families or the students are expected to use the devices in a particular manner, and they are required to sign formal agreements that they would treat the devices in as best as a manner as possible. So there are agreements that need to be signed by families and by students in that regard. So the authority has, as far as it possibly can, put maintenance agreements in place to ensure that the devices continue to be end of life.
Thank you. Member Ndassing.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Very quickly, we have heard a lot of statistics and data here this morning, and all that is well and good for public consumption, but the reality of the challenges still exist. I heard from Ms. Agard speaking to a project under the auspices of the Archdiocese of Port of Spain. And I hope she said that it will also take into consideration other denominational schools. I hope for inclusivity purposes, it takes into consideration schools such under the purview of Swaha, under the Mahasabha, under the Presbyterian Board, under the Baptist community, under the Anglican Church, and so on.
Absolutely. And as I said, they are the coordinating agency for other denominational schools. So in the list of students who do not have internet access that they were provided, they collated information from principals of other denominational schools representing those communities that you just mentioned, so that the list is a comprehensive list that we've received. You are absolutely correct.
Thank you very much, Ms. Agard. Further to that, Chairman, in our documentation, we would have heard that Digicel had formally requested temporary additional spectrum in March of 2020, and this was installed in terms of the access by May of 2020. And they have further requested the allocation of temporary spectrum in terms of their broadband width and so on. And Digicel is currently awaiting a response from the Telecommunications Authority. While I do not, I am not on the side of any service provider, I hope that the Telecommunications Authority will continue to meet and treat with the requests of the service providers, all in our quest to improve the broadband width and connectivity for the school children, especially vulnerable school children of our society. And if someone could clarify this issue of the cost of pole rental, which is impacting upon the whole question of connectivity. Just for my benefit, I don't know if other members of the committee would want to that information. And in addition to that, the issue of reliability of service needs to be addressed, because I speak in the context of a parent, as a parent, in terms of children who are in online classes. And I know for a fact that especially at the tertiary level and so on, children are very apprehensive in the middle of their examinations, online submissions and so on. if service goes down, what are the implications with, for example, institutions? If you are writing, for example, an examination in Trinidad, you are online, and it goes down, will that institution, let us say in Europe or North America, would they be aware of the challenges and how that will be resolved in the interest of the student and so on? I have known of situations where children have actually panicked in the middle of examination.
I guess we can start with Ms. Agard and go to Mr. Smith on that.
So, as I said, the reliability issue in terms of our network is something that we monitor on an hourly basis, and we produce daily reports in terms of the performance of all of our networks. And of course, we are subject to, unfortunately, a lot of power outages from TNTech, and that has had an impact on our service ability in some areas. As far as the pole rental issue is concerned, I am assuming that is a reference to TNTech pole rental. We have certainly at TSTT recently concluded an agreement with TNTech in relation to pole rental rates, and we are very happy in terms of the outcome of those negotiations.
Mr. Smith and then Mr. Prescott.
Sure. So first, Member Indar Singh, you had mentioned the temporary spectrum. TATT, yes, has issued that, and we're working closely with them on that, and they've been very helpful. And us, when we talk about the coverage is one challenge, but addressing the capacity of existing customers is another. And working with TATT, that's been helpful. That spectrum has been helpful. With regards to pole rentals, I think that was raised in the documentations. I know from our side, is we, in response to ideas on how we can more affordably address and further our coverage, there are a series of costs which if lowered could make it possible for us to reach further with our network. So that's the context within which that was brought up. In terms of reliability, Chandrika, if you could mention about reliability.
Sure. So as mentioned on the call earlier, TNTech power outages do impact us. We do have on every single one of our cell sites battery backup, as well as generators on all of our major cell sites with a 5 to 7 day runtime. We also have redundant links to all of our major POPs, as well as redundant links internationally as well. So we have tried our best to ensure that our service is as reliable as possible. Unfortunately, we are still impacted by external factors such as fiber breaks, when very tall vehicles just pull our fibers down, etc. And you would find that the most frequent losses of coverage is due to the time it takes to recover from that.
Mr. Prescott?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for bringing us in. As it relates to pole rental costs, it is a constraint. It's a challenge. Obviously, as with one of the themes that have been discussed on today's session is affordability of internet. How do we make internet more affordable? And as Digicel CEO Ibrahim mentioned, if we have this input as a cost, that's going to limit how affordable you can get. And the challenge, of course, when you go to these rural areas is that you have to attach to more pools and cover less homes. So, for example, you go to a rural area, let me compare it to an urban area. You go to a nice urban area, you could attach to one pool and connect to 5-6 homes. But when you go to a rural area, it's reverse. You have to connect to 5 pools, attach to 5 pools to connect one home. And if that pool rental cost is prohibitive, and when we look at the regional costs, when we benchmark it across the region, Trinidad by far is one of the highest, if not the highest, in terms of pole attachment costs. So that will limit our ability. If we have to attach to 5-6 poles to connect to that one home, that will limit our ability to say, let's offer that customer, internet for $90 or $99 a month, and so on and so forth. If it is, we have to pay T&Tech over $100 a month just to attach to those poles. So if there is an opportunity to work with the electricity company, with a sort of a tiered rate structure, so, where we go to these rural areas, they can consider reduction in their pole rental costs. That would be a formula which may help us to get to be able to serve these rural areas with more.
I think a good intermediary would be, of course, the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation.
Yes, correct, absolutely. In terms of reliability, so that is one of the things we've seen coming out of this whole pandemic, is that the expectation of our customers has increased significantly. And member Indara saying, perfectly articulated some of the challenges. We place huge emphasis, just as Mr. Samaru from Digicel would have mentioned, on network reliability, on redundancy. But there's only so much, that you can do. There is going to be external breaks. There are going to be burning homes. There are going to be poles that are hit by trucks or trucks pulling down cables, that sort of stuff. That is the reality of the networks we run, because these networks are public networks. They're not, private concealed networks. They run on poles. They're external. They're exposed to the public. So our challenge as providers really, beyond the putting in the redundancies and so on, is really to have that quick response, so that when incidents do occur, to be able to detect and respond and resolve as quickly as possible. But we fully acknowledge Mr. Indara Singh's, member Indara Singh's comments there, and definitely it's one of the pillars upon which we place a huge emphasis on ensuring that our network is as reliable as possible.
Thank you. I don't want to end this session, because we're coming up on just about 12 o'clock here, without dealing with what is a critical issue in education in Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly around the globe, because education is positive and education can be negative. And there's the issue of inappropriate content when children have access to the internet. And I want to start with Mrs. Reddock Down on what TATT's perspective and policy is on regulating inappropriate content to children who are in many instances at home, online, going to school, and in some instances themselves transmitting inappropriate content and are vulnerable to inappropriate content, and also to the service providers and what their safeguards are in place as they provide these services to children on an increased level. So we start with Mrs. Reddock Downs on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to say that, this whole area has occupied the mind of the authority and the thinking of the authority over the years. And what we've tried to do as much as possible is to put public education programs in place. As a matter of fact, on next week, Tuesday, I think it is, we will actually be convening on TTT a live program on keeping children safe online. We will be having a panel discussion, as well as have persons being able to call in live to the program, because we think it's just so important for us at this time to make sure that parents are aware of how they are to protect their children, and children are aware.
Mrs. Reddock Downs, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you, because your bandwidth seems a bit challenging, could you just take off your video and we'll hear you clearly?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Right. So I was saying that this matter is very important to us at the authority. We are convening a program next week on TTT, and that program is meant to assist and to educate parents and children themselves about how to protect themselves online. The program is a call-in program, and it's live, and it's part of our public education program to make sure that students make themselves available for this type of education. It's something that's troubling to us at the authority as well, because as you know, the internet has become much more pervasive. It means that everybody has access to all kinds of content. And regulation of the internet, it's not something that is very easy to deal with at this time. And what we try to do more than anything is to have a campaign of public education so that persons are in a position to protect themselves. But certainly, there is a lot of discussion taking place at the authority with regard to content and particularly with regard to protection of children and the internet.
From TATT's regulatory perspective, are there mechanisms and programs or systems that can act as protective devices or barriers to these sorts of inappropriate content and, in some instances, predatory behavior?
Yes, certainly. If there are websites that are carrying content that's inappropriate, like, for instance, child pornography and those kinds of things, then in those instances, it's appropriate that those sites are not made available. And certainly, in our MOU with the Ministry of Education with regard to the devices, and certainly, I mean, I know the Ministry of Public Administration can speak to themselves with regard to their own policy in this regard, with regard to the Wi-Fi services that we are providing. We are making sure, as far as possible, that children are protected from visiting those sites. I mean, it's not entirely foolproof, but we have attempted as far as possible to do so as well.
Thank you. Ms. Agard, from TSTT's perspective in terms of providing protections for online learners.
Chairman, thank you very much. The whole issue about inappropriate access to content by children and other vulnerable groups in the society is obviously a huge issue. Unfortunately, we do not regulate the internet. And while there is some technical capability to be able to block access to sites, we certainly could not do so without some, I think, legislative directive or legislative mandate.
But if it's a, because you mentioned earlier on, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are education packages that you've offered, packages geared to facilitating education. So with those packages, certainly there can be some parameters that apply to those packages, that you can't wander around the internet or go to X and Y site, and it's limited to education-focused sites that are approved by the Education Ministry or the Ministry of Social Development or the Ministry of Health, etc. Is that a possibility, or is it beyond your remit as a provider?
So what we have done, Chairman, is that the access to the online learning tools are free to the students as part of the package. So that is what we have done to ensure and to facilitate the online learning that is in place by the Ministry of Education. But I'd like my CTO to specifically address the issue of blocking access to certain sites.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, yeah. So what it is, right? We can apply certain filters to internet. So what those filters do, they block certain types of traffic. However, when we apply the filter, it is across the board. So everyone in the household, because more than likely the internet is shared across the household, they will not be able to get access to all the applications. And that, in our mind, because our customers, they have been not happy with that type of arrangement, because it means it protects the child, but the parents would not be able to access the sites they want to go to, because the internet is a shared resource. And that is where
but they're benefiting from your subsidized prices and lower packages.
Well, again, the customer, in their mind, they are paying for a service which is internet access. So they want to ensure they get their full whatever they want to use and use it. They don't want to be limited by the providers. So that's the position the providers and them find themselves in, right? Because this is a voluntary thing to say, hey, put on this filter for us that protects the internet And that is the challenge the providers have.
And I think that is why, and you know, there are things like that challenge this industry, like pirated video content that is interfering with our ability to provide subscription broadcasting services or cable TV services. So we recognize as an industry that there is a challenge. From our perspective, we can be the internet police in the absence of a clear legislative mandate coming from the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. And so perhaps it is appropriate that we are addressing this august body now.
I thought you were going to say that. Mr. Smith, thank you for saying that. Mr. Smith.
No, I agree there. To holistically solve the problem, yes, there need to be some policy elements addressed, perhaps in a different forum. Together as an industry, we can discuss. Technically, we're ready to comply and work with whatever policy comes from that. But there's also tools that can be put in individuals' hands. And so we've done a couple of things specifically during this period. The first of which, partnering with the TTPS Cybercrime Unit to do some webinars to educate families about online bullying and safe online practices. The second is in our mobile application BIP, we have a service in there called Safe2Net, which we provide free for 2 months, which provides the ability for parents to monitor and control and regulate children's activity online. And then third, we recently included parental controls in our Wi-Fi mesh smart Wi-Fi product that is available for our home internet users. So that product allows parents to set timelines, restrict certain sites. So we've tried to put those tools in parents' hands rather than control from the network side.
Understood. Mr. Prescott.
Yeah. So I'm in the unenviable position, as always, to follow my colleagues. So pretty much they've captured the main areas of tackling this issue. Education, making parents aware so that they can take necessary measures. And of course, their service provider tools that where the service provider can provide tools for the parents, or parents can source their own tools to provide that sort of filtering, management, determining which sites that the folks in the home can go to, and so on and so forth. So that is basically at this time, until such time as the legislative environment evolves to one that allows ISPs to go in there and sort of either be informed of or advised of or seek approval of certain sites that should not be permitted, as my colleagues at TSTT would have referenced. In the interim, definitely public education, as well as providing those facilities in the hands of our subscribers to be able to manage the sites that the folks in the home go to is definitely.
Just before I go to Member Beckles and Member Ford and their final questions, because we're running out of time, Mr. McKellar, is that under consideration in terms of policy from the ministry? Those kinds of protections?
At the moment, no, but certainly our remit does include putting in place a number of policy positions that would address internet usage, although we might be focusing right now primarily on the mainstream public service rather than the wider community. In that regard, I think we would look more towards the Telecommunications Authority as the standard setter. But also the Ministry of Public Administration is represented on a children's registry policy committee that is being led at the OPM, Office of the Prime Minister. So I think through that mechanism, there is space for us to make some contributions and recommendations.
Thank you, Member Beckles and Member Ford, and then we'll have to go to our round robin wrap-up comments, please.
Hello?
Yes, we're hearing you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, yes. I just wanted to quickly ask a question that I think, or repeat a question that may not have been answered, and it has to do with the issue of incentives, whether it be for businesses or other persons who are allowing the use of Wi-Fi, whether it be in certain public spaces, and the issue of communities, rural communities, in terms of the cost, whether there is any consideration for special packages for those communities. And again, for the disabled, I had asked specifically for that. And, I went to, I think it was Moruga recently as well, and they seem to have very poor access Wi-Fi.
Thank you. And I could add to that, because in the package submitted by TSTT, and I remember in the media, you rolled out 2 free Wi-Fi initiatives, I believe, around the Queen's Park, Savannah, and also Woodford Square. It may have been late 2019 or early 2020, and there were plans to roll out in rural areas and underserved areas those Wi-Fi free areas. And what has become of that, because that would have been one of the solutions I think could have worked in areas that are underserved and where communities are presently clamoring for some sort of service that is subsidized by the state at that level through an agency like TSTT, and if that is still on the cards.
And Chair, just very quickly, the issue of the CSRs, both in Digicel and TSTT, I mean, granted, they spoke to us about the gaps and so, has that been one of the interventions to probably help some of the communities that are not certain as to what services actually being provided? Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess those 2 questions from Ms. Agard.
Okay, so I would like let Kenrick speak to the public Wi-Fi initiatives. Yes, we did roll out free public Wi-Fi for 30 minutes in the morning and I think in the afternoon, in the Queen's Park, Savannah, and in Woodford Square. And we do have plans to also roll out similar Wi-Fi capabilities in other parts of Trinidad and Tobago. Kenrick, you want to talk to that a little bit further?
Yes, so as part of our initiative, we partnered with one of our partners, and we would have done the Queen's Park, Savannah, to roll out Wi-Fi. So that gives you like twice a day, you get like 30 minutes, you could come on, check your emails and that type of thing. We also did Woodford Square. Currently, we have one more location we are currently looking at to actually as an addition to that. And again, we are looking at all the various locations where we have coverage and to see is there additional areas we can supply the service.
Well, it's interesting you started in Port of Spain, basically, and I guess it was a pilot project, but certainly that would be so much more appreciated without having any bias to Port of Spain, whatever, in rural areas where there is so much more of a vulnerability. And is there a timeline on the rollout of those kinds of initiatives, which I think are very admirable, in places like Moruga, Deep South, where there is, to me, more of a greater need, as articulated by many of the stakeholders who came before us. And those families can really use, because of their socio-demographic status, a free service even for some hours of the day, which I think is a brilliant project.
So actually, we did look at several areas, included some of the rural areas like Point Fortin and those Princestown, all those areas. We did look at all of those areas. But as you know, these types of initiatives are really capital intensive, right? So we got stuck based on the fact that we needed to take them in small bites. So that is why we have been just rolling them out. However, we do them in small installments because, again, the organization with its partner has been funding these types of initiatives. So hence the reason why we only got to the 2, and we are planning 1 again in this year. And as we go along, we will be adding to that number.
1 for the year?
Well, no. So we have definitively planned. We are looking at others, but it is very difficult to say right now with any certitude what other areas we may consider, because of course it is all dependent on the availability of capital.
Yeah, I can well imagine. Final call for Member Ford, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on the rental poles concern. I know MP Indar Singh brought it up, and I know Mr. Prescott from Flow spoke about concessions, spoke about a possible tier-rated system. And seeing that we have the main providers there, we also have the ministry there, in terms of a future collaboration, because again, this is critical, especially in the rural remote areas, where, as we know, the houses may not be close by, and there may be a need in order to ensure that these poles are put in place in order to ensure connectivity. So, but what I did not hear from you, Mr. Chairman, is that we did not hear from P.S. McKellar on what are the ministry thoughts with regards to probably providing, some sort of recommendation in going forward in making some sort of concession with regards to this whole system of pole rental and other coming together with regards to ensure at the end of the day, no child be left behind during this pandemic as we try to ensure full connectivity in Trinidad and Tobago. Thanks.
I think I did mention that Mr. Keller and the ministry are adequately poised to be an intermediary between TNTech and these issues.
Right, Chair, if I may, just in response to the member's question, I think that particular matter falls more to the Ministry of Public Utilities, the issue of pole rentals, and any discussion between the utilities and the ISPs.
But certainly as the PCPS in the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation, you can be in excess. So I'll hopefully add that as a favor on your table.
Sure.
You can bring them together. Okay, we are certainly out of time. I'm going to ask for closing comments, and starting with Mr. Prescott from the County Manager for Flow.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the opportunity to hold the mic first. So from a closing comment perspective, I really want to thank giving us this opportunity to have this deliberation. For you all to share with us some of your concerns. I think it was instructive. The feedback from the members about some of the previous sessions you all had and some of the representations you all have had in terms of areas that are desperately unserved. From our perspective, we have continued to invest every year well over $1 million US in expanding to new areas. So we've continued to build into new rural areas. At the end of last year, we'd have done, Chatham, which is sort of west of Point Fortin, Captiville. We would have done areas in Barrackpore. We right now looking at areas in deep Sangre Grande and so on. So rest assured, where there's an economic case, even though the payback may be longer, we are fully committed to continuing to expand. We would acknowledge, though, that there are some areas, and this is where I heard Member Nakid talk about there's a disconnect. I don't think there's a disconnect, guys. We're saying the same thing. There's a 5% of homes, and when you take 5% of homes and you multiply that by the 400,000 homes in the country, there are 20,000 homes out there that need to be connected, right? Whether the exact number is 15,000 or 25,000, there are those homes that still need to be connected. So we are committed to working with the regulator through their universal service program, with the industry, and whichever other stakeholder is willing to partner with us for us to get those remaining 15 to 25,000 homes connected. Because we fully agree. And I thank Member Ford for his, reiterating the point on seeing how we could partner as an industry to see how we could, seek some sort of tiered arrangement in rural areas to bring down the cost. So we are happy for those sort of discussions, those sort of ideas, and hoping that some of these items that we've discussed today can bear some fruit and allow us to get access into some of those rural areas and connect more homes.
Thank you. And just to follow your point, one of the resounding, I think, profound bits of commentary coming out of this is that while it may sound like 5% or 10%, we find in society that those are the persons of society who are always left at the end of the table. So you'd find their screams are the loudest because for decades they have been left underserved. So it may be 5% while we're doing well with 90% or 95%, but those people are also important and have to be served. Next, Mr. Smith, CEO of Digicel TT.
Sure. In the last 2 or 3 minutes closing, first, thank you. Second, to Member Beckel's question about CSR initiatives, I think that will continue to be a part of how we solve this. From our foundation side, for example, this past year, we've addressed 24 special needs schools with SIMs, 6 months of free data for the students, 50% discounts for the teachers, 10 additional special needs schools, 18 mainstream schools, another 15 schools where we're donating devices and services to individual students. So yes, CSR initiatives will continue to be a part of how we help to bridge this. And I appreciate today the conversations about what we can all do together to address accessibility in the rural areas. I think we've got some good ideas in between the Ministry of Public Administration, TATT, and us as an industry. We can accomplish that, and as well as resolving affordability. So I welcome the continued work together, and thank you for this session today.
Thank you. And while we're at it also, while we're seeking to serve children with disabilities and children with special needs, and I know you are all innovative companies, and just bear in mind the importance of assistive technologies. I know you are technology driven, and providing those assistive technologies and innovative technologies to students with special needs to provide a different kind of support. So sometimes it's not only access, but a different type of accessibility they need to provide for their needs.
I'll take that as a personal action item, sir.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Ms. Agard, CEO of Acting of TSTT.
Thank you so very much, Chairman, for this opportunity to present to this committee on this very significant issue of broadband and broadband access and affordability to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. TSTT has been around for 100 years. We expect to be around for another 100 years, supporting the development of our Trinidad and Tobago. We have made significant investment over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years. For the past 5 years, we've invested over 160. I think the investment is $1.6 billion in the rollout and the enhancement of our ICT infrastructure to increase and improve broadband coverage in Trinidad and Tobago, both on the mobile side and on the fixed side. We will continue to play our part in CSR initiatives. We have many CSR initiatives that we have rolled out over the many years of our existence. And I give this committee the assurance that TSTT will continue to play a significant role in building our families, building our communities, and building our beloved Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. And just as we say, keep in mind that your investment is not gone unappreciated and unnoticed. It's really an investment in your next category of customers and base.
Yes.
So you're investing in yourselves and the future of the country. Thank you so much for your contribution. Mrs. Cynthia Reddock Downs, CEO of TATT. Next, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm hoping that you're hearing me a little bit better now. I am certainly grateful on behalf of the Telecoms Authority to have had this opportunity to meet and have these discussions with both members of the committee and with service providers. I think this opportunity, what it's done for us is to identify from members how the people of Trinidad and Tobago feel about what gaps there are in service provision and about the access and affordability issues that they do have and sometimes we are not necessarily aware of. I think for us at the authority, we recognize that we have made significant strides over the years from 2004 to now, but there's still some work to be done. And that work is not only about connectivity, it's also about making sure that the ICT skills of the population of Trinidad and Tobago are improved, and that we use the ICTs for the purposes for which we believe they were intended. That is to develop the country, Trinidad and Tobago, much more so as a full-scale country, and to also ensure that our educational abilities of our students, our population is improved considerably by the ability to access ICTs. I think this has been a great opportunity, and I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for giving us that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Reddock Downs. And last but by no means least, the acting PS in the Ministry of Public Admin and the Digital Transformation, Mr. McKellar.
Thank you, Chair. Certainly, it has been a pleasure for the Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation to participate in this morning's discussion, the inquiry. It has really been eye-opening and enlightening, not only for, I guess, the members of the committee, but for the national population. We've heard a lot from the different providers and TATT and the ministry in terms of our own efforts to facilitate the educational process during the pandemic. And I think there's much to celebrate, but of course we recognize that there's still a lot to be done. We do recognize that there are gaps. For me, it was particularly eye-opening hearing some of the statistics that you shared at the start of the discussion with regard to the figures in terms of the number of student hours that have been lost. And we could, of course, calculate how many student hours have been lost in Trinidad and Tobago. The Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation is committed to working with all the relevant partners in terms of ensuring that there is ubiquitous connectivity across Trinidad and Tobago. We will continue to do our part to ensure that we roll out as many access centers, push forward with the TT Wi-Fi initiatives so that there is that connectivity, not just for students, but for all citizens, because not only are we interested in human capital development from the standpoint of our students, but also in terms of our adults, persons who may need to develop the new skills, reskill, retool, because there have been job losses and people need to identify new opportunities for economic development. So we are committed to furthering the process. And again, we are committed to sharing any information that may come to us in terms of subsequent questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one of the things I'm hoping that comes out of this, where the Ministry of Public Admin and Digital Transformation, is that there's a closer working relationship between the MPs, because certainly the 3 MPs that are on the committee, including MP Beckles, MP Ford, and MP Indarsing, is that their communities have been crying out because segments of their communities are underserved. So I'm glad that all the stakeholders were able to hear firsthand from the MPs who interface with their constituents and burgesses on a daily and weekly basis what their needs and what the gaps are. We'd like to thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate your contributions. You are the last group we're meeting with, because while we were doing the interfaces with the 3 groups before, these were the constant themes that were popping up. And one of the United Nations papers coming out of the global pandemic states that while gaps have been identified, because the pandemic has forced the world to go online so quickly, it provides an opportunity for a de-stratification of services, and in particular, educational stratification that we have complained about in Trinidad and Tobago, where the prestige schools versus the government schools, and the gaps between. We have an opportunity here to equal the playing field if we identify, the issues and collaborate to confront them, to provide an equal playing field and an equitable environment for all learners in Trinidad and Tobago, because that's the goal of this committee, to ensure that all students, no matter where they come from, no matter what background they come from, no matter what their personal home resources are provided with an equal playing field for their potential to be developed. And that's why we thought, as stakeholders in the digital realm, you are in a position, you are all in a position to facilitate that. So we thank you for what you are doing now, because we don't underestimate or underappreciate what you're doing now, but we certainly have put on the table where the gaps are and where we can proffer improvements. On behalf of the entire committee, we'd like to once again thank you for being here and for your contributions. And to our listening and viewing audience, we thank you for being here. On behalf of the committee, we wish you a safe day and a productive day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee is now adjourned.
So we are free to leave.
I think so.
Yeah. All right, Curly. I don't know. Okay, yeah, we're free to leave. You have to be last to leave, though.